China's rise has been, well, remarkable. Over the last few decades, we've seen its economy transform and its global influence expand at an unprecedented pace.
Yeah, it's been really something.
Many believe we're entering an Asian century, with China leading the way, but is that really a sure thing? What does the future hold for China?
No, it's not as simple as just assuming they'll keep rising.
Right, there's more to the story, isn't there?
Yeah, a lot more. When you look closely, the picture gets a lot more complex. Some of the same factors that drove their growth might actually turn into problems.
That's a fascinating point. What were the main drivers behind China's rise in the first place?
I'd say there were four main tailwinds that really helped them get to where they are today. First, they had a long stretch of peace and quiet on the geopolitical front. For a country with such a history of turmoil and conflict, that stability was crucial.
Yeah, especially considering they're surrounded by some pretty powerful and sometimes unpredictable neighbors.
Exactly. For much of the 20th century, China was dealing with constant internal and external pressures. Opium Wars, the end of the Chinese Civil War, then the Cold War, hostility from both the US and the Soviet Union. It wasn't until the 1970s when they opened up to the US that they got a break from all that pressure.
And that timing was key, wasn't it? The world was entering a period of hyper-globalization, with trade and investment booming.
Absolutely. China was perfectly placed to take advantage of that. They became the workshop of the world. Their manufacturing fed global demand, and that really fueled their economic engine.
So they had stability and good timing. What else?
Well, after Mao Zedong died, the government shifted its focus. They started prioritizing economic performance over ideology, and they adopted a more decentralized approach.
You mean they loosened their grip a bit and let people take more initiative?
Yeah, sort of. It wasn't intentional at first. The Cultural Revolution, as devastating as it was, actually weakened the central planning system, and that created space for more private markets and industries to emerge.
And the Communist Party just rolled with it.
Eventually, yeah, they realized that these private enterprises were actually driving economic growth, so they let them flourish.
Interesting. So that's two tailwinds. What was the third?
The demographic dividend. They had a massive workforce and relatively few dependents.
Meaning lots of workers and not so many mouths to feed.
Exactly. At its peak, China had something like 10 to 15 workers for every retiree. That's 2 to 3 times the global average.
Wow, that's huge. How did that happen?
It was a combination of factors. Mao's policies in the 50s and 60s led to a baby boom, and then the one-child policy dramatically reduced birth rates in the following decades.
So you had a huge generation entering the workforce with few children to support and even fewer parents. Many of them didn't survive those turbulent times we talked about.
Right.
Okay, so security, effective governance, and a demographic boom. What was the fourth tailwind?
Abundant resources. Until recently, they were pretty much self-sufficient in crucial things like water, food, and energy. This kept production costs low, and it meant they had plenty of cheap raw materials to fuel their manufacturing boom.
So they had everything going for them. It's no wonder their economy took off.
It really was an incredible set of circumstances, but, and this is a big but, all of those advantages are starting to disappear.
You're saying the things that fueled their rise might now hold them back.
That's right. Those tailwinds are turning into headwinds. They're running out of resources. The demographic advantage is fading, and their political system is becoming more rigid.
This is where things get interesting, right?
It certainly complicates the narrative of China's unstoppable rise.
Let's unpack this a little. How has this abundance of resources turned into a problem?
Well, China is now facing a stark reality. They're running out of essential resources. To give you an idea of how serious this is, half of their rivers have vanished, and 60% of their groundwater is too polluted to even touch.
Wow, those are some serious numbers.
They are. And it's not just water. They used up a lot of their oil, and even coal is becoming scarce. Think about it. Beijing has about as much water per person as Saudi Arabia.
That's incredible considering how arid Saudi Arabia is.
Exactly. So they're shifting from being self-sufficient to being dependent on imports for their most basic needs.
So they're at the mercy of global markets and whoever controls those resources.
In a way, yes. They're the world's biggest importer of both energy and food now, and that makes them vulnerable. Prices fluctuate, supply chains get disrupted, political tensions flare up. It all adds up to a much riskier situation.
And a lot more expensive too, right?
Yeah.
Importing all that food and energy for 1.4 billion people can't be cheap.
You got it. The cost of raw materials has skyrocketed. To produce the same amount of GDP, it costs them 3 times more now than it did back in the 2000s.
So the days of cheap and readily available resources that fueled their economic miracle are gone.
Pretty much. And it's not just resources that are drying up. That demographic dividend we talked about,
Yep.
it's going away too.
Right, we were talking about that earlier. The baby boomers are retiring, and there's a much smaller generation to replace them.
Exactly. Over the next 10 years, they're expected to lose over 70 million working-age adults, while gaining over 130 million senior citizens.
That's a massive shift.
It is. Imagine this. The entire population of France vanishing from the workforce, and the entire population of Japan suddenly needing retirement benefits. That's the scale of the change they're facing.
Wow, that's hard to even wrap your head around.
It is. And it means that worker to retire ratio, which used to be their strength, is going to plummet. By the late 2030s, it's projected to be just 2 to 1.
That's a huge burden for a shrinking workforce to carry.
Yeah.
And it seems like they're also dealing with political changes that could make it even harder to adapt.
You're absolutely right. Since Xi Jinping consolidated his power, the focus has shifted. It's more about political control now, and less about economic efficiency.
So it's becoming harder for them to adapt and respond to these challenges.
Exactly. Think about the zero COVID lockdowns. They were meant to protect public health, but they also really messed up economic activity and global supply chains.
And what about the crackdown on dissent in Hong Kong? That surely didn't help their image internationally.
No, it didn't. It made a lot of international investors nervous about doing business in China. These examples show how political priorities are taking precedence over economic pragmatism.
So they're losing their flexibility at a time when they need it the most.
Exactly. And on top of all that, they're facing pushback from the international community. The trade war with the US, similar actions by the EU and Japan, they're losing access to global markets, capital, and technology.
So the open global system that helped them rise is becoming less welcoming.
That's right. And it's not just economics. Their security situation is becoming more difficult too. The U.S. is expanding its military presence in the region, and that's creating a sense of encirclement. Tensions are rising.
So to recap, their resource advantage is gone, their demographic edge is fading, global markets are closing up, and now their security is being challenged. Where does that leave China, and what does it mean for the rest of the world?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The world has enjoyed the benefits of China's rise, but now it's like we're all experiencing a bit of a China hangover.
A hangover? What do you mean by that?
Well, think about it. During China's boom years, a lot of countries got a triple win. China was a booming market for their exports. They had easy access to Chinese loans for development projects, and they could hire experienced Chinese companies to build their infrastructure.
So everyone was riding the wave of China's growth.
Right. But now that wave is receding, and it could pull a lot of countries down with it.
I see what you mean. Can you give some specific examples of how this hangover is playing out?
Sure. As China's economy slows down, they're buying fewer imports. That hurts exporters like South Korea, Germany, and all the countries that rely on selling raw materials to China.
And what about those Chinese loans?
They've dried up. And countries that borrowed heavily from China, like Venezuela, Laos, Zambia, even Pakistan, are struggling to repay their debts.
So the global system that enabled China's rise is now being strained by its slowdown.
That's a good way to put it.
And what about the geopolitical implications? How might China react to all these pressures?
That's where things get really interesting and potentially dangerous. Throughout history, there's been a pattern when it comes to peaking powers, countries that have reached the height of their power and are now facing decline.
So a nation that senses its dominance slipping away.
Exactly. And they don't usually go quietly. They tend to become more assertive, more prone to taking risks, both domestically and internationally.
Like a cornered animal lashing out. Are there any historical examples of this?
Oh, plenty. Look at the United States in the late 19th century. They went through a period of rapid growth, expanding westward, but then they were hit by a series of economic depressions.
And how did they react?
They cracked down on dissent at home and turned toward imperialism abroad. They started annexing territories and building up their military overseas.
So a classic case of a peaking power trying to cling to its dominance. Any other examples?
Sure. Russia's expansionism in the early 20th century and their recent actions in Ukraine also fit this pattern. Even Germany and Japan's reactions to the Great Depression militarization and expansionist policies, it's all part of this historical trend.
And you're suggesting that China, facing similar pressures, might follow this path.
There are some worrying signs.
Such as?
Well, domestically, there's a growing cult of personality around Xi Jinping. There's a surge in hypernationalism, repression of ethnic minorities like the Uyghurs. They're building a surveillance state that's, well, pretty Orwellian.
It does seem like they're tightening their grip on power.
They are. And their economic strategy is shifting too. They're moving away from just focusing on growth and starting to use their control over key parts of the global economy to gain leverage. Think about things like rare earth minerals, medical supplies. They're trying to dominate those supply chains.
So they're becoming more assertive, maybe even coercive, in their approach to international trade.
You could say that. And then there's the military buildup.
Right. We can't ignore that. There's been a lot of talk about China's military expansion.
It's not just talk. They're engaged in the biggest peacetime military buildup since, well, Nazi Germany. They're churning out warships, expanding their nuclear arsenal, and their military deployments are becoming more and more assertive, especially in the Taiwan Strait, the South China Sea, and along the border with India.
So they're putting their money where their mouth is.
They are, and it's a clear sign that they're willing to use force, or at least the threat of force, to get what they want.
And they're not doing this alone, are they?
No. They're building alliances with other autocratic powers like Russia, Iran, and North Korea.
So it seems like we're entering a new era of great power rivalry, One that could be as dangerous and unpredictable as any we've seen before.
It could be.
And the big question is, how do we manage this rivalry? How do we prevent it from spiraling into conflict?
That's the challenge, isn't it? Historically, these kinds of rivalries rarely end peacefully. It often takes major shifts in the balance of power, sometimes through war, to reach a new equilibrium.
So are we destined for conflict? Is there no way to break this cycle?
It's not inevitable, but it's going to be very difficult. The core issue is trust, or rather the lack of it. It's hard for rivals to make concessions without fearing that the other side will exploit those concessions.
So it's a catch-22. They can't cooperate because they don't trust each other, and they don't trust each other because they can't cooperate.
Exactly. Take the issue of Taiwan. The U.S. wants China to back off, but China worries that if they do, it'll embolden Taiwan's independence movement. The U.S. wants China to stop its military buildup, but China sees that buildup as essential to protect its interests in what they perceive as a hostile world.
So no easy answers there.
Not really, and the potential consequences of miscalculation are huge.
So are we headed for a new Cold War, one that could potentially turn hot?
It's a real possibility. But there's also a chance, albeit a slim one, that a different kind of bargain could be struck.
What kind of bargain?
One where China accepts limits on its regional ambitions, basically giving up on the idea of dominating Asia in exchange for continued economic access to the West and security guarantees.
So they'd become a more responsible stakeholder in the international system.
That's the idea. But for that to happen, there would have to be a significant shift in the balance of power. Either China's economy would have to slow down dramatically, or the U.S. would have to decline, which is less likely.
So we're in a very precarious situation.
We are. And it's important to understand the historical precedents and the forces at play if we want to navigate this new era successfully.
Well, that's a lot to think about.
It is. It's a complex and challenging situation, and there are no easy answers. But let's go back to some of the challenges we were talking about. The resource depletion, the changing demographics, the political climate. It's worth digging a little deeper into those. Let's start with the resources. How's China dealing with this whole resource depletion issue?
It seems like a pretty massive problem.
Yeah.
They built their economy on being the world's factory, and that takes a lot of energy and raw materials.
Exactly. And now that their domestic resources are running low, they've had to become more reliant on imports.
Which makes them more vulnerable, right?
Right. They're exposed to price swings, supply chain disruptions, and geopolitical tensions that could cut off the flow of essential goods. Not to mention the financial strain.
Yeah, importing that much food and energy to keep 1.4 billion people going can't be cheap.
It's a huge burden on their economy, and it really undermines their whole economic model, which was based on being the low-cost producer.
So costs are going up, resources are getting scarce, and the global economic landscape is shifting. What are they doing to deal with this resource crisis?
They're trying a few different things. One is diversifying their import sources. They're striking deals with resource-rich countries in Africa, South America, Central Asia, places like that.
So, spreading the risk, so to speak.
Exactly. They're also investing heavily in renewables to reduce their reliance on fossil fuels.
That makes sense. Fossil fuels are finite, and there's the whole climate change issue to consider as well.
Right. But these are long-term solutions. What about the here and now?
Good point.
Well, they're trying to improve efficiency, cut down on waste, and promote conservation. But at the end of the day, There's a limit to what they can do. They simply don't have enough of the resources they need to keep growing at the same pace forever.
So the resource crunch is a very real problem that's going to have a major impact on their future, no matter what they do.
I think that's a fair assessment.
Okay, let's move on to the demographic challenge. You mentioned the worker to retiree ratio is changing rapidly. How is China handling this aging population?
It's a huge problem, a demographic time bomb. Shrinking workforce means slower economic growth, and all those retirees put a huge strain on healthcare and social security.
It's the consequence of those decades of population control, isn't it?
It is, and they're struggling to manage it.
Didn't they recently scrap the one-child policy?
They did, but it's probably too late to make a big difference. The effects of those policies are baked in. Even if they encourage people to have more kids now, it would take generations for that to really impact the workforce.
So they're stuck with the consequences for the foreseeable future.
Pretty much.
So a shrinking workforce, a growing number of retirees, and dwindling resources. It sounds like a recipe for instability.
It's definitely a cause for concern.
Are there any other steps they're taking to deal with the aging population?
They're exploring a few options. Raising the retirement age, encouraging people to work longer, promoting private pensions. But these are all politically sensitive issues.
I can imagine. People don't like it when you mess with their retirement plan.
Exactly. It's a tough situation with no easy answers.
It sounds like they're walking a tightrope.
Hmm.
And you mentioned Xi Jinping's consolidation of power, this shift toward a more authoritarian approach.
Yeah.
What are some of the specific policies that are raising red flags?
Well, the crackdown on dissent is a big one. Silencing independent voices, controlling information. The repression of minorities, especially the Uyghurs, is a major human rights issue that's drawing international criticism.
And they're tightening their control over the internet, the media, using surveillance technology to keep tabs on their citizens.
Yes, all of that. It's the kind of behavior you see from authoritarian regimes when they're facing internal pressures and uncertainty.
They circle the wagons and clamp down.
Right. They try to maintain order and suppress dissent, even if it means sacrificing long-term stability and prosperity.
So how is this internal repression affecting China's foreign policy? How are they interacting with the rest of the world?
It's making them more assertive, more confrontational. They're challenging U.S. dominance, flexing their military muscle in the region, and pushing the boundaries of acceptable behavior in international relations.
And the South China Sea is a prime example of this, right?
Absolutely. Their territorial claims, the island building, the aggressive actions against their neighbors, it all points to a China that's willing to use force to get what it wants, even if it means alienating other countries and raising tensions.
And it's creating a lot of friction with the United States.
For sure. The U.S. is in a tough spot. They want to protect their interests and reassure their allies, but they also don't want to provoke China.
It's a delicate balancing act.
It is. And the stakes are high. One wrong move could lead to disaster. We're back to that trust issue again. When there's so much distrust, it's almost impossible for countries to make concessions or do anything that could be seen as a sign of weakness.
So we're stuck in a vicious cycle.
We are. And it's not just about military or economic power. There's also a clash of values at play. China's authoritarian model is fundamentally different from the liberal democratic values of many Western nations.
So it's a clash of ideologies.
Exactly, and that makes it even harder to find common ground and build trust.
It's not just about territory or trade or resources. It's about how we see the world, how we think societies should be run. Some people are even calling it a clash of civilizations.
That might be a bit dramatic, but it does capture the essence of the challenge. It's a struggle between different systems, different ways of life. And the outcome of that struggle will have a huge impact on the future of global order.
A pretty unsettling thought. Is a world divided along ideological lines inevitable? Is there any hope for peaceful coexistence?
It's a real possibility, but we can't give up hope. We still have the power to choose a different path, to work towards a future where countries can live together peacefully despite their differences.
It's a tall order, but it's worth fighting for.
I agree. It's a story with a lot of chapters left to write, and the choices we make will determine how it ends. We talked about the internal challenges China's facing and how those pressures could spill over into the rest of the world. But we haven't really gotten into the specifics of how they're actively trying to reshape things globally, both economically and geopolitically.
That's an important piece of the puzzle. What are some concrete examples of China trying to assert its influence and maybe even change the world order as we know it?
Well, the Belt and Road Initiative is a prime example. It's this massive infrastructure project spanning multiple continents that aims to connect China to the rest of the world through a network of roads, railways, ports, pipelines, you name it.
It's like a modern-day Silk Road,
Right.
recreating those ancient trade routes that connected East and West.
That's a good analogy. It's an incredibly ambitious undertaking, and it has the potential to really shake things up in terms of global trade and geopolitical alliances.
But it's also been met with a lot of criticism, concerns about debt traps, environmental damage, lack of transparency.
Yeah, there are definitely valid concerns. Critics argue that China's using the Belt and Road Initiative to expand its economic and political clout, maybe even burdening developing countries with unsustainable debt and extracting resources for its own gain.
So a form of neocolonialism disguised as development aid.
Some people see it that way, but China insists it's all about investing in much-needed infrastructure to boost economic growth in developing countries. They say it's a win-win partnership.
Two very different narratives then,
Yeah,
which highlights the growing distrust between China and the West.
exactly. And that distrust fuels tensions not just between China and Western powers, but also between China and its neighbors in the region.
Like the South China Sea dispute, for example.
Right. China's actions there, their territorial claims, the military buildup, it's all created a very volatile situation.
It's a region with a lot of historical baggage, overlapping claims, competing economic interests, and now you have this rising power, China, asserting itself in a way that's upsetting the balance and making everyone nervous.
It's a recipe for instability, for sure. And the U.S., which has traditionally been the guarantor of security in the region, is in a tough spot. They need to project strength without provoking, deter aggression without escalating tensions.
Easier said than done.
Definitely. It's a high-stakes game, and one wrong move could have disastrous consequences. It all comes back to that issue of trust. In an environment where everyone's suspicious of each other, it's really hard to make concessions or do anything that might be perceived as a sign of weakness.
So we're stuck in this spiral of distrust and escalation.
We are. And it's not just about military or economic power. There's also a fundamental clash of values between China's authoritarian model and the liberal democratic values in many Western nations.
So it's a clash of ideologies as well.
Exactly. Different visions for how societies should be organized and governed, And that makes it even harder to find common ground and build trust.
It's not just about territory or trade or resources. It's about how we see the world, what we believe in. Some people even frame it as a clash of civilizations.
Maybe that's a bit over the top, but it does get at the core of the challenge. It's a struggle between competing systems, and the outcome will have a huge impact on the future of global order.
It's a sobering thought. Is a world divided along ideological lines inevitable? Is there any hope for peaceful coexistence?
It's a real possibility, but we can't give in to despair. There's always hope. We can still choose a different path, work towards a future where countries can live together peacefully despite their differences.
It won't be easy.
No, it won't, but it's a goal worth striving for.
Where do we even start? What can we do as individuals to contribute to a more peaceful and prosperous future?
It starts with education, with understanding these issues, with having thoughtful conversations with people who see things differently than we do. We can support organizations working to promote peace and understanding between nations. We can advocate for policies that prioritize diplomacy and conflict resolution over military solutions.
So it's about recognizing our shared humanity, our common desire for a world where everyone can thrive.
Exactly. We're not just passive observers in all of this, we're participants. Our choices, our actions matter. We have a responsibility to shape the future we want to see.
That's a powerful message. Even in the face of these enormous challenges, we have agency. We can choose to be forces for good, to advocate for understanding and peace, to work towards a future where cooperation and mutual respect prevail.
That's what we need to strive for.
Well, that's a hopeful note to end on. We've covered a lot of ground today, exploring the complexities of China's rise, the challenges they face, and what it all means for the future. It's a story that's still unfolding, and we all have a role to play in shaping its ending. Thanks for joining us on this journey.
It's been my pleasure.
And as we sign off, we'd like to leave you with a musical suggestion, a song that captures the energy and rebellious spirit we need to navigate these uncertain times. Check out Slow Death by the Dictators. It might not give you any answers, but it'll definitely get you thinking.